As we step now into that message portion of our service, I want to review the fact that last week we heard about Jesus going to doubting Thomas, and Jesus showed us that he doesn't leave people where they are, but he brings them to faith in him. And today we're going to see Jesus actually doing that again with Peter. But before we see that, we see another awesome fish story from the Bible. We'll hear about that in our video this morning.
"3 days after Jesus died on the cross, he came back to life. More than once, Jesus appeared to his disciples and proved that he was alive. One day, Jesus met his disciples while they were fishing on the Sea of Galilee. Peter and the other disciples got into a boat to go fishing. They spent all night on the water, but they did not catch any fish. The next morning, as the sun was coming up, Jesus stood on the shore. He called out to the disciples, but they did not recognize him. Jesus said, 'Men, you don't have any fish, do you?' 'No,' they answered. 'Put your net in the water on the right side of the boat, and you will catch some fish,' Jesus said. The disciples did what Jesus said. So many fish were in their net that they could not pull the net back into the boat. One of the disciples said to Peter, 'It is the Lord.' Peter jumped into the water so he could swim to shore. The rest of the disciples traveled to the shore in the boat, pulling the net full of fish behind them. When the disciples got out of the boat, they saw bread and a charcoal fire with fish on it. 'Bring some of the fish you've caught,' Jesus said. So Peter pulled the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153 of them. 'Come and have breakfast,' Jesus said. Jesus took the bread and gave it to them. Then he gave them the fish. Jesus turned to Peter. 'Do you love me more than these?' he asked. 'Yes, Lord,' Peter said. 'You know that I love you.' 'Feed my lambs,' Jesus told him. Jesus asked Peter again, 'Do you love me?' 'Yes, Lord,' Peter said. 'You know that I love you.' 'Take care of my sheep,' Jesus said. Jesus asked Peter a third time, 'Do you love me?' Peter was very sad that Jesus asked him a third time. Peter loved Jesus very much. 'Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you.' 'Feed my sheep,' Jesus said. Jesus told Peter that he would bring honor to God. Then Jesus said to him, 'Follow me.' The disciples had turned away from Jesus when he was arrested, but Jesus still wanted to use them in God's plan as fishers of men who would tell people the good news about Jesus. Jesus is the Lord who forgives us and makes things right again.
So Jesus wasn't done with Peter yet, and Jesus isn't done with you yet either. I will never forget this moment. I was still a kid. I was working my first job. I had convinced my dad's boss to hire me to do some things around the office to get some spending money. And I was standing on the steps of the loft when I learned one of the most important lessons I would learn in my life. You see, the job was just dusting the office. My dad was my supervisor, and I was doing it. I was dusting the office. I knocked this little ceramic piece off of a shelf while I was dusting, hit the ground, shattered. And so I spent like the next half hour, because the vacuum cleaner wasn't working, putting the little pieces of that ceramic thing back in the trash can so that nobody would step on it. And at the end of all of that, I was exhausted and I was a little bit demoralized because I had done more damage than good. And so I started walking up the steps to the loft. I figured I was done working for the day. And my dad asked, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm done for the day. I've worked a few hours and I'm not doing very great." And I will never forget the next line. He says, "That's not how any of this works. You don't get to tell me when you're done. I tell you when you're done." And that's actually the lesson that I think Peter learned in our story today. He thought that he was done and disqualified from the ministry of Jesus. He had messed it up big time, a lot worse than knocking a little ceramic piece off the shelf. He had messed up big time, and it looks like he thinks he's probably done with Jesus. But Jesus comes to tell him that he's not done with him yet. If you remember this story, Peter was the one who said that he would love Jesus more than anyone else. He said, look, Jesus, you could go to the cross, you could go to your death, even if I have to die with you. There is nothing in this world that would stop me from following you. And then later that night, things went downhill. All of the disciples ran away. Peter ran away too, but Peter actually came back. He was in the courtyard. During his trial, Peter is in a courtyard around a charcoal fire with a few other folks. And these people start asking Peter, hey, do you know this Jesus guy? And he denies it. 3 times around the charcoal fire, Peter denies knowing Jesus. And I think from that moment, it looks like Peter must have thought of himself as disqualified from doing God's work because he had messed up so big. But Jesus is going to show him that he's not done with him yet. I wonder sometimes if we maybe live that same story of Peter. If maybe there are times in our lives where we feel like we could be disqualified from the ministry of Jesus. Well, because I look at my life and I don't really see the life of the ideal Christian. Could Jesus really use me here? Maybe I look at my life and I think of all of the times that I have tried to serve Jesus. I've tried to tell the people I love about Jesus, to bring them into the church, and they just keep shooting me down. Maybe I'm just not good enough to be doing the work. Or I look at my life and think, well, am I really living the story of Jesus enough? Are people going to hear me talk about Jesus and then be offended because then they see that I'm not perfect either? And maybe you're there. Or maybe you're not there and you think you are qualified for the ministry of Jesus. And if that's where you are, I think there are times when we have to realize that even the best things that we do, well, even those things often have a selfish motive. You see, the truth is, if we're honest with ourselves and we're honest with our motives and we're honest with our lives, all of us are disqualified for the ministry of Jesus. All of us have a reason to walk up the stairs to the loft and say, I'm done working. But the truth and the gospel message for this morning is that even if you think you're done, Jesus isn't done with you yet. And Jesus wasn't done with Peter yet either. That's what this story is about. Even though Peter hangs it up and says, I'm going back to fishing, Jesus calls him back in. And he sets this meal before them, and I think we have to realize the significance of this meal is really important. That Jesus doesn't make meals for people he's holding a grudge against. Just the fact that Jesus invites Peter to the meal is a tangible marker of the forgiveness that Jesus is offering him. Peter has Jesus' forgiveness, but Jesus doesn't just leave it at that. He doesn't want Peter to just have to infer forgiveness for himself, but he wants to draw Peter in deeper to this forgiveness. And that's why he calls to him and asks this question, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Because remember, you said you loved me more than these, and there were those 3 denials. But what Jesus does here is beautiful because he replaces the denial that Peter had around a charcoal fire in the courtyard with this confession that he has around the charcoal fire in front of Jesus. Jesus draws the confession out of him. Peter, do you love me? Well, he doesn't call him Peter, he calls him Simon, son of John. Do you love me? And Peter says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. 3 times. And on that 3rd time, you can almost imagine that Peter hears the rooster crowing in the back of his mind. And yet, he sees the forgiveness in the eyes of Jesus as he calls him to him again, do you love me? And Peter has an opportunity for faithful confession. And Jesus makes it very clear Let's put that slide up there for that Bible verse. Jesus makes it very clear in this verse, every time he asks him, he makes it very clear that Peter has a job to do. He's not done with Peter yet. He says, feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. Jesus isn't done with Peter. He calls him to forgiveness, and then he delivers to him a job to do. And he ultimately does the same thing to us. Jesus isn't done with you yet because he is here again today delivering forgiveness and giving you a job to do. This is the whole reason we gather here. The reason we gather here is to replace those denials that we have had throughout the week. The way that I have lived my life, well, it hasn't been like I believe that Jesus is coming back. Every time, all the time. The way that I have lived my life has had these little subtle denials here and there. But when we gather here in this place, Jesus takes our sin seriously. And we start our service with a confession of that sin. But the sin doesn't define us anymore. The sin, Jesus takes it away, and he replaces it with a faithful confession of faith, where we get to say through our songs and through the words we speak, we get to say, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. We get to have that confession, and then we get sent with a job to do, to tend the sheep. And maybe tending the sheep for you looks like continuing to tell that person who has kind of rejected your offer to come to church, well, to say, hey, Jesus still loves you, and we're still here for you. Maybe tending your sheep for you parents is taking that intentional time to build your children up in the faith. Or kids, maybe tending the sheep for you is taking a little bit of time to prioritize the things that matter to your parents, to say, well, that matters to mom, so maybe it should matter to me too. We have a job to do, and we have not been disqualified from it because Jesus renews us in that vocation. He delivers his forgiveness so that we can serve him with no doubt in our minds that Jesus is not done with us yet.